We have talked many times about the very odd dynamic that exists between the United States and Israel. Essentially, Israel would not be able to have a sophisticated military. It would not be able to fund its military. It would not be able to go around threatening its neighbors or have protracted wars every few years and bomb people, except for the fact that the United States pays for all of that. In an agreement negotiated between Barack Obama and Benjamin Netanyahu on the way out of Obama's administration, they signed a deal that automatically transfers $4 billion of taxpayer money every year from the American Treasury to the state of Israel. That's automatic. It just happens no matter what. Some of that is required to be spent on American arms dealers. So it profits Raytheon and General Dynamics and Boeing. But a lot of it they can just use how they want to use it. All that, despite the fact that Israelis get benefits from their government that millions of Americans are without. The Israelis have a higher standard of living than millions of Americans, even though the United States subsidizes and pays for this foreign country's military. And then on top of that $4 billion we give them, every time they have a war, every time they're thinking about a war, we send them billions more. And not just send them billions more for free. They can just, here's billions more to use to buy military bombs, to buy bombs and missiles and other military equipment that you need. We send them the arms as well. We send them all these bombs to the point we deplete our own stockpiles. And every bomb they're dropping is either paid for with American money or comes from the United States itself, says made in the USA on them. And the whole world knows this. When people in the world see images of Gaza being destroyed and thousands of children, tens of thousands of innocent people in Gaza dying continuously, everyone in the world knows it's an American war. It's from the United States. So you would think that would create a dependency on the part of the state of Israel, where because we pay for their wars, because we enable them to fight these wars and to fund their military, you would think that if the United States government says, hey, this thing that you're doing or are considering doing, we don't want you to do because it's contrary to our interest, it would mean, of course, Israel would immediately say, oh, I guess we can't do it. That's how Ukraine functions. Ukraine's dependent on the United States. So if the United States comes and says, we don't want you to diplomatically resolve this war with Russia, as Zelensky was going to do at the beginning of the war, Ukraine has to say, okay, whatever you say, we'll do what you say because we need you. We depend on you financially. And Ukraine has done everything the United States has directed it to do. Because that's the normal situation when someone is completely financially dependent on you. They're required in return to listen to the things that you want and say, not necessarily fully or obediently, but certainly to take them into serious account. And on the cases where the United States says, what you're about to do harms our interests and we don't want you to do them, you would think Israel would not do them, because a country that just says, hey, F you, we're going to defy everything you say, the natural response would be, okay, well, then we're not going to continue to fund you if you're going to do things that harm our interests, such as starving Gazans to death in front of the entire world, which turns countries against us, which makes it impossible for us to do deals, which brings the world closer and closer to China and away from us. The United States probably doesn't care morally about humanitarian aid in Gaza, but strategically it might. And so the Israelis had discussed that the Knesset, their legislature, was returning this week, and there were members of the Netanyahu government that were advocating a bill to ban the only aid agency capable of delivering humanitarian assistance and food and medicine and water to the people in Gaza who are without it, which is UNRWA. And the Israelis were saying, we're going to consider a law that will ban UNRWA from operating in Israel and therefore in Gaza. Will prevent them from distributing any aid in Gaza. And on Monday, the day that the Knesset returned, Matthew Miller, the U.S. State Department spokesman, who has spent a year and a month or however long since October 7th of last year, defending pretty much everything Israel does, even massacres and the worst things you can imagine. He was asked about this law that some Israelis were considering implementing, and here's what he said.
Knesset is examining a legislation that would ban UNRWA that would be able to work in Israel and in East Jerusalem. What are your thoughts on that?
So we have made quite clear to the government of Israel that We are deeply concerned by this proposed legislation. The Secretary raised this in the letter that he sent with Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of Defense to Minister of Defense Gallant and Minister of Strategic Affairs Dermer a little over 2 weeks ago. As he made clear in that letter, passage of this legislation could have implications under U.S. law and U.S. policy. That remains the case. Look, UNRWA plays a critical, important role in delivering humanitarian assistance to civilians that need it in Gaza. That's not the only role they play. They play an important role providing services to Palestinians in the West Bank and throughout the region as well. But they really play an irreplaceable role right now in Gaza, where they are on the front lines getting humanitarian assistance to the people they need it. There's nobody that can replace them right now in the middle of the crisis. So we continue to urge the government of Israel to pause the implementation of this legislation. We urge them not to pass it at all, and we will consider next steps based on what happens in the days.
Okay, so that was about as strong as you will hear the United States government being when telling Israel, don't do this. Now, I happened to watch that State Department briefing live on Monday, and I knew the Israeli Knesset was planning to meet that later that day and would likely implement that law, the very law that the United States said, we don't want you to pass. If you pass it, you're going to basically prevent humanitarian aid from getting into Gaza. 2 hours after that press briefing, 2 hours, 3 hours at the most, the Israeli government went and just overwhelmingly passed that law, the very law that the United States says you should not pass because it's going to make it impossible to get humanitarian aid to Gaza. They didn't even pretend to take into account what the United States government was saying. They didn't even wait a day. They did it the very day that, in a very public way, the United States government stood up and said, we're against this law. This law is horrific. And we urge the Israelis not to implement it. From the New York Times that same day, Israel's parliament passes bills banning agency that aids Palestinians. Quote, in doing so, Israel defied calls from the Biden administration, which has warned that the legislation could prompt an even greater humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Most of the law's provisions will not take effect for 3 months, and their full legal ramifications were not immediately clear. The relief agency has played a critical role in coordinating desperately needed humanitarian aid. Israel has criticized UNRWA for decades, arguing that its work aiding Palestinian refugees and their descendants further perpetuated the long-standing territorial conflict with Israel. The Israeli government has accused a handful of the agency's 13,000 employees in Gaza of participating in the Hamas-led October 7th attacks on Israel last year that triggered the war. The legislation passed on Monday night had the potential to push the agency's operation into precarious and uncharted territory. So you can't really get defiance greater than that, although this is by far not the first time that Israel has done this over the last year, and they've done it in ways even more humiliating still. They seem to take some sort of joy and pride in publicly humiliating the U.S., making completely clear that they don't care in the slightest what the U.S. government wants, or at least claims it wants, pretends publicly to want, as we head into an election. But it's still, the entire world sees the United States government telling what should be its vassal state because it finances it, don't do this. And immediately Israel turns around and says, we're doing exactly what you just told us not to do. On October 13th, basically 2 weeks ago, a letter was sent to the Israeli government from U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Pentagon Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, basically telling Israel, you are creating a serious humanitarian crisis in Gaza, and if you don't take actions to alleviate the starvation and the suffering, you have 30 days to do it, and if you don't do it, we're going to strongly consider freezing arms shipments to you. Now, they immediately ran to the press and said, oh, we're not saying we're going to freeze arms embargo. We're just saying we would consider it if they don't do the things that we asked for. And again, the 30 days just so happens to expire after the election. So they may be doing this for political cover to show Arab voters with whom they're in a lot of trouble in Michigan and elsewhere that they're at least trying. And then after the election, they're not going to care about this at all. But still, publicly, it looks again like the United States is issuing demands and decrees to Israel that they're just ignoring. Here's part of what that letter said that was very flamboyantly and publicly sent to Yoav Gallant, the Minister of Defense for Israel, as well as the Minister of Strategic Affairs, Ron Dermer. Quote, dear ministers, The humanitarian situation for over 2 million civilians in Gaza is increasingly dire. We are particularly concerned that recent actions by the Israeli government, including halting commercial imports, denying or impeding nearly 90% of humanitarian movements between northern and southern Gaza in September, continuing burdensome and excessive dual-use restrictions, and instituting new vetting and onerous liability and customs requirements for humanitarian staff and shipments, together with increased lawlessness and looting, are contributing to an accelerated deterioration in the condition in Gaza. Relatedly, we are deeply concerned about the potential adoption of Knesset legislation to remove certain privileges and immunities from the United Nations Relief and Works Agency and its staff to prohibit contact with UNRWA and change the status quo regarding UNRWA in Jerusalem. While we share your concerns about the serious allegations of certain UNRWA employees participating in October 7th, and Hamas misusing UNRWA facilities, enactment of such restrictions would devastate the Gaza humanitarian response at this critical moment and deny vital educational and social services to tens of thousands of Palestinians in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, which could have implications under relevant U.S. law and policy. We ask that you take all possible steps, whether with lawmakers or using the authorities of the Prime Minister's office, to ensure that does not come to pass. We also urge you to provide UNRWA with additional information regarding these allegations, just as we continue to urge UNRWA to ensure it has a process in place to implement reforms to ensure confidence in the totality of UNRWA's personnel. So that was a letter designed to threaten Israel and say, if you continue to starve the Palestinian population, to block off food and water and medicine, under our law, and this has been a law that the United States has been violating for almost a year now, the United States is barred from sending weapons or money to purchase weapons to any country that is engaged in war crimes, which obviously includes collective punishment of Palestinians or any attempt to starve them. And the Israelis have done nothing in that letter. In fact, since that letter was sent, fewer trucks and humanitarian aid has been allowed by the IDF into northern Gaza. I think we're going to find out in just a little bit with full confirmed certainty. We're already getting a lot of reports that I regard as reliable. That what's happening in northern Gaza is an atrocity on a level that we haven't seen in this century. The things we're hearing from northern Gaza are beyond horrific in terms of the Israeli military targeting and just blowing up multiple residential buildings and apartments with entire families inside. They have attacked the hospital. There's basically no ambulance service. There's no healthcare system. There's no hospital system to treat the wounded. They just die. They began giving vaccines for polio, since polio is spreading in Gaza where it had been previously eradicated, to children and other people, and they only got the first dose, and now nobody can get in to give the second dose, which is required for it to be effective. And just the amount of sadism and destruction. We've seen IDF soldiers posting videos laughing as they destroy buildings and talking about how this is where they're going to rebuild and have all sorts of beautiful Israeli apartment buildings with beach views. So I think the United States government in part is trying to pretend that it's doing something to express concern, because the history is going to show what this actually was. And the United States government has been funding it and arming it all the time, even if they were publicly pretending that they wanted it to be a little softer. Here's something that Matthew Miller was asked about on October 29th regarding the U.S. relationship with Israel.
U.S. ambassador to Israel, there were reports about that he was being in touch with Israeli opposition leaders about this legislation not to move forward, so that Israeli MPs who were actually backing that bill kind of felt under pressure by so-called U.S. interference.
So I'm not going to speak to particular conversations with the government of Israel, but we made quite clear in a letter from the secretary, from himself, and from this podium that we are opposed to the implementation of that legislation, and that there could be consequences under U.S. law and U.S. policy for the implementation of that legislation. So I don't think we could have been any more clear about our position when it comes to this bill.
Ban UNRWA. What do you think about this whole direct direction of this whole Israel versus UN situation going, like Israel attacking UNIFIL in Lebanon, Israel discussing to ban UNRWA in Gaza, and also Israeli Foreign Minister multiple times criticizing UN Secretary General for asking ceasefire or uninterrupted humanitarian aid flowing into Gaza, which is repeatedly asked by US as well.
Look, I think in a number of important ways, the relationship between Israel and the United Nations is not one that's productive, and is not one that serves the citizens of Israel well. It certainly doesn't serve the Palestinian people well. And so in a number of different contexts, we have urged the government of Israel to work more cooperatively with the United Nations, particularly to work more cooperatively with the United Nations humanitarian organizations that are delivering humanitarian assistance to people inside Gaza, and will continue.
Now, this has always been one of the most remarkable things about the U.S.-Israeli relationship, is that many times key American officials like David Petraeus and State Department officials have come out and said, and they're always forced to apologize afterwards, that our close relationship with Israel is what generates the anti-American hatred in that region. That's a major reason why so many people in that region hate us, because they know we're the ones empowering Israel and enabling Israel to just slaughter Muslims and Arabs whenever they feel like it, with no restraints at all. And the United States government never stops them, never imposes limits, just continues to do whatever the Israeli government wants. In other words, our own interests are severely undermined by what Israel does. And many times the United States government has told Israel publicly not to do things that the Israelis just completely ignore and proceed to do anyway. Here was one of the most flagrant. This was in March of 2024. Here from Politico, Biden says that it's a red line for Israel to invade Rafah. Rafah was the refugee camp where all the Palestinians had been told by the Israeli military to go, that was designed to be a safe space for them. And so a large percentage of the Gaza population went to the refugee camp in Rafah. And then the IDF and Netanyahu started talking about bombing it and invading it militarily and forcing the people who had gone all the way from their homes to Rafah to either die or have to find somewhere else to go. Talk about old people and young children constantly being displaced internally. So Joe Biden came out and used the phrase red line, which is presidential talk for, this isn't something we're asking. This is something that if you cross, there will be grave consequences. That was Politico, March 10th, 2024. Biden warns of a, quote, red line for Israel over Rafah. Cyprus said aid ships get ready to open humanitarian sea corridor to Gaza. So at the time, it was unthinkable that the IDF would invade Rafah. And yet that very same day, here from Politico, the same day, March 10th, quote, Netanyahu vows to defy Biden's red line on Rafah. Quote, when asked on Sunday whether Israeli forces would move into Rafah, Netanyahu replied, we'll go there. We're not going to leave them. I have a red line. I have a red line too. You know what my red line is? That October 7th doesn't happen again, never happens again. The prime minister was referring to the murderous Hamas raid that killed more than 1,160 people in Israel and triggered the war. So the U.S., not only did they invade Rafah, and at first the U.S. government said, oh, they're just invading it a little bit. We were meant a real invasion, like a full-scale invasion. They destroyed Rafah. They bombed it. They shelled it. The entire military went in, totally ignored Biden, and made very clear that they were going to ignore Biden. And obviously there was not a single consequence at all. The United States just gets humiliated over and over by Israel. Now, you may want to say, no, this isn't the Israelis humiliating the United States, because what the United States is pretending in public it wants Israel to do, they tell them in private, keep going. We're fine if you invade Rafah. We're fine if you choke off northern Gaza. And that may very well be true. But at least the appearance that's being created, even if it's not the reality, is that the U.S. makes demands of Israel, gives them ultimatums, and the Israelis openly stick their middle finger up at the U.S. Netanyahu laughs at these demands, even these red lines, and right in front of the whole world just does exactly what the United States demands that they don't do, and nothing happens. The U.S. is petrified of alienating Israel for reasons that are well known and that we've talked about many times before. We've had John Mearsheimer on and Stephen Waldon, both of whom are the authors of The Israel Lobby, that talk about the great power of the pro-Israel lobby in the United States. It was a 2006 book I've asked both of them whether that still applies, and both of them have said, if anything, the pro-Israel lobby is even stronger now. So the U.S. government is petrified, especially with an election looming, but in general, of defying Israel in any way, even if it means sacrificing U.S. interests to do so. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.